The advertisement was for a wife to tend the chickens, was the first and only thing the agent had said to her that held the ring of truth. Mylin stepped down from the train, her small, tightly wrapped bundle held in 2 hands. The heat of the Nebraska plains rose in a shimmering wave from the baked earth, a physical presence that pushed against the fine wool of her gray cheongsam. The dress was plain, high-collared, and immaculate despite the long journey. It was the only thing of quality she owned, and it served as a kind of armor against a world that was all vast, bleached sky and an endless ocean of grass. He was waiting, as promised. A tall man, broad in the shoulder but stooped, as if carrying a weight that had long since settled into his bones. His name was Samuel Bell. His hat was pulled low, casting his face in shadow, but she could see the sun-weathered lines around his eyes and a mouth set in a permanent expression of grim endurance. He did not look at her face, but at the small bundle in her hands, then gave a curt nod. He said. The word was rough, unused. He took a step back as if she might break. The wagon's over here. He did not offer to take her bundle. She did not expect him to. The ride to the homestead was silent, broken only by the creak of the wagon wheels and the snap of the reins. She sat straight-backed on the hard wooden seat, her gaze fixed forward. She saw a land of brutal beauty, but also of hardship. The grass was long but turning yellow in the relentless sun. The creeks they passed were thin, sluggish veins of brown water. The homestead, when it came into view, was even more stark than she had imagined. A small, unpainted cabin of graying timber, a listing barn, and a series of wire fence runs where dusty chickens scratched listlessly at the ground. It was a place teetering on the edge of failure, and the neglect was a palpable thing, a scent of dust and resignation on the air. Samuel pulled the wagon to a halt and gestured vaguely toward the cabin. The house, he said, unnecessarily. Then he pointed to the chicken runs. And them. They're the reason. He finally looked at her, his gaze a quick, assessing sweep. Can you manage chickens? I can manage, she said. Her voice was quiet, but clear. It did not waver. He seemed to accept this. He led her inside. The cabin was a single room, bisected by a threadbare curtain for privacy. It was clean, swept bare, but achingly empty. A rough-hewn table with 3 chairs stood in the center. A cold cookstove. 2 narrow beds on one side of the curtain, and a small cot on the other. He pointed to the cot. That's yours, he said. The children are out. They'll be back before supper. He seemed to run out of words then. He stood awkwardly by the door, turning his hat in his hands. The well is out back. The work is from sunup to sundown. You get your keep, a roof. That was the bargain. Mylin gave a slow, deliberate nod. She placed her bundle on the foot of the cot, but did not unpack it. It sat there, a neat, self-contained promise of departure, a testament to the fact that she had learned long ago to never fully arrive anywhere. The bargain is acceptable, she replied, her composure a stark contrast to the raw, unspoken misery of the small cabin. He seemed relieved, and with another curt nod, he was gone, leaving her alone in the silence of her new life. The children arrived as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery streaks of orange and purple. A girl of about 14, with her father's wary eyes and a posture of premature responsibility, and a small boy of 6 or 7, his hair the color of sun-bleached straw. The girl, Martha, stopped dead in the doorway, her face hardening as she saw Mylin standing by the stove. The boy, David, peeked around his sister's skirt, his expression one of wide, uncomplicated curiosity. Father said you were coming, Martha said, her voice sharp with suspicion. She did not say a welcome. She did not offer her name. She stepped inside and began setting the table with 3 plates, 3 forks, 3 cups. The exclusion was deliberate, a clear and painful line drawn in the dust of the cabin floor. Mylin said nothing. She simply inclined her head in greeting and remained where she was, a still, quiet figure in the corner of their grief. Samuel came in after them, his face grim. Supper was a silent affair. Salt pork, hard biscuits, and water. Samuel and Martha ate with a grim efficiency, their eyes on their plates. David, however, kept stealing glances at My Lin, who had not been offered a plate and had not asked for one. She stood by the cot, her hands folded, waiting. This was part of the bargain, too. To take up as little space as possible, to be less than a ghost at their table. The wound in this house was plain to see. It was in the empty fourth chair at the table, a space that no one looked at but that dominated the room. It was in the way Samuel's gaze would sometimes drift to a row of faded wildflowers pressed into a book on a high shelf. It was in Martha's fierce, protective glare, a shield she held up against any woman who might dare to try and fill the void her mother, Sarah, had left. After the meager meal, when Samuel had retreated outside and Martha was scrubbing the plates with a vengeance, David walked over to My Lin. He stopped a few feet away and just looked at her. "Your dress is the color of a storm cloud," he said, his little voice cutting through the heavy silence. My Lin looked down at her grey cheongsam, then back at the boy. A flicker of something soft crossed her face. "Sometimes storms bring rain," she answered quietly. "And rain makes things grow." David considered this with the gravity of a philosopher. He gave a small nod, as if she had just explained one of the world's great mysteries, and then went to his bed behind the curtain. My Lin remained standing, her own small bundle a silent companion, listening to the lonely sound of the wind scraping against the walls of the wounded house. The next morning, My Lin rose before the sun. She moved with a practiced quiet, slipping out of the cabin while the others slept. The air was cool and smelled of dust and dry grass. She went directly to the chickens. What she found was not a flock, but a study in quiet desperation. The birds were thin, their feathers dull. The coop was filthy, the air thick with ammonia. The water troughs were slimy, the feed scattered and fouled. It was a place of slow decline, mirroring the homestead itself. She did not sigh. She did not despair. She simply began. One small thing at a time. First, she entered the coop, scraping it down to the bare wood with a broken spade she found leaning against the barn. She hauled bucket after bucket of clean water from the well, scrubbing the roosts and the nesting boxes. She left it to bake in the morning sun. Then she turned her attention to the birds themselves. She moved among them with a calm that seemed to soothe their skittishness. She identified the sickest ones, their eyes clouded, their breathing ragged, and gently separated them into a small, isolated pen she constructed from scrap wire and old planks. She would not allow the sickness to spread. She spent the rest of the morning foraging at the edges of the property, her eyes scanning the ground with an intensity that Samuel, watching from the barn, found unsettling. He saw her gather plants he had always considered weeds, dandelion greens, purslane, wild clover. She brought them back and mixed them with a small amount of their precious grain, creating a feed that was both more nutritious and would make the grain last longer. She found a patch of wild mint near the creek and crushed the leaves, adding them to the fresh water she put out, knowing it would help keep it clean and encourage the chickens to drink. By the time the family stirred, the entire chicken operation had been silently and fundamentally transformed. The air was cleaner, the birds were calmer, and a sense of order had been imposed on the chaos. She had not asked for help or permission. She had simply seen what needed to be done and done it. That evening, when she finally took a small portion of food for herself, after everyone else had eaten, she found 2 eggs sitting by her cot. They were small and pale, but they were a beginning. She had been hired to tend the chickens, and that is what she would do. She would make this small corner of a failing world whole. David was the first to cross the invisible line. He started following My Lin on her daily rounds, a small, silent shadow trotting behind her. He watched, fascinated, as she showed him how to spot the hidden nests where the cleverest hens laid their eggs. She taught him to recognize the plump, green caterpillars the chickens loved, and he would collect them for her in a jar. She never used complicated words. She would just point and demonstrate, and he would understand. One afternoon, as she was grinding herbs with a smooth stone, he reached out and placed his small, grubby hand on top of hers. It was a simple, trusting gesture, a moment of contact in a house that seemed starved of it. My Lin's hand stilled. She looked down at his small fingers resting on her own, and a warmth spread through her chest, unfamiliar and profound. She gave his hand a gentle pat before returning to her work, but the connection had been made. He was hers now, in his own quiet way. Martha was a far harder conquest. She watched Mylin's every move with an air of critical judgment. She saw the chickens getting healthier, their feathers growing glossy, the egg production slowly but steadily increasing. She smelled the strange, savory herbs Mylin added to the stew, making their meager rations taste like something more than just survival. She noticed her mending, the stitches so fine and even they were nearly invisible, making worn shirts and patched trousers last another season. But she said nothing. Her approval was a fortress, and she would not surrender it easily. The turning point came on a hot, blustery afternoon. A gust of wind had caught Martha's favorite dress, a simple calico her mother had made, where it was airing on a line. It snagged on a nail on the side of the barn, tearing a long, jagged rip in the fabric. Martha's cry was one of genuine anguish. She snatched the dress down, her face crumbling as she looked at the damage. It was more than a tear, it was another loss, another piece of her mother taken from her. She threw the dress onto her bed and refused to speak for the rest of the day. That night, long after the cabin was dark and quiet, Mylin lit a single candle. By its flickering light, she took the ruined dress. She worked for hours, her needle flashing, her brow furrowed in concentration. She did not just patch the hole. She embroidered over it, creating a delicate, winding vine of tiny, pale blue flowers that followed the line of the tear, transforming the scar into a thing of beauty. The next morning, the dress was folded neatly on Martha's bed. Martha saw it and stopped, her breath catching in her throat. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the intricate, impossible stitches. She looked over at Mylin, who was kneading dough for the morning biscuits, her back to her. For a long moment, the girl stood there, the dress clutched to her chest. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Thank you." It was not a surrender, but it was a truce. And in the quiet of the cabin, it sounded as loud as a declaration. Samuel noticed everything. He was a man who communicated with the land, with the heft of an axe, with the set of a fence post. He spoke in actions, not words, and he read the actions of others with the same quiet acuity. He saw the way the chickens now ran to greet Mylin, a bustling, feathered committee. He saw the neat rows of herbs she had planted by the cabin door, a small patch of vibrant green in the dusty yard. He tasted the difference in the food, the subtle, nourishing flavors that spoke of care and knowledge. He saw the mended dress on Martha and heard the change in his daughter's tone, the sharp edge of her resentment beginning to dull. He saw David holding Mylin's hand, a sight that sent a complicated pang through his chest, a mixture of gratitude and a grief he could not name. He said nothing. Acknowledgement felt like a betrayal of the memory he clung to so fiercely. But he could not let her quiet, relentless competence go unanswered. His response came in the language he knew best, work. One morning, Mylin went out to the coop to find a new stool sitting beside the door. It was made of freshly cut pine, sturdy and smooth, sanded down so there were no splinters. It was exactly the right height for her to sit on while mixing the feed. There was no note. No explanation. It was just there. A few days later, a load of firewood appeared, neatly stacked and covered with a top, right by the cabin door. It saved her the long walk to the main woodpile, a trip she made several times a day. He had watched her route, calculated the effort, and provided a solution. The most significant gesture came one cool morning. He was leaving for the fields before dawn, as he always did. For weeks, Mylin had risen after him, making her own small cup of tea from the herbs she had gathered. But on this morning, she came into the main room to find 2 cups on the table. One was his, half empty. The other was set at the place she never sat, a thin wisp of steam rising from it. It was weak prairie tea, nothing like her own, but it was a second cup. It was an invitation. It was a word he could not speak, made visible on the rough-hewn table. She sat down in the empty chair, the one that was not the ghost chair, and wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic. She did not drink it right away. She just sat there, in the quiet, and felt the silent conversation that was beginning to unfold between them. He had seen her work. And he had answered with his own. The fragile peace of the homestead was disturbed by the arrival of a man in a black suit and a bowler hat. He rode up on a fine horse, its coat gleaming in the sun, a stark contrast to Samuel's weary plough horse. He dismounted with an air of easy ownership, his smile wide and pleasant, but it did not reach his eyes. "Samuel, my good man," he boomed, clapping a hand on Samuel's shoulder. Samuel flinched at the contact. "Just my monthly visit. Checking on my investment." This was Mr. Abernathy, the banker from town. He was the man who held the note on the farm, a fact he mentioned with the casual frequency of a man discussing the weather. He strode into the cabin without waiting for an invitation, his gaze sweeping over the single room with a look of faint distaste. He noticed Mylin, who was quietly grinding corn by the stove. His smile tightened. "Well, well. A new addition to the household," he said, his tone laced with a condescending amusement. "Another mouth to feed, Samuel?" "Bold move, in your position." Samuel's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He simply stood by the door, a prisoner in his own home. Abernathy sat at the table, pulling a sheaf of papers from his briefcase. He spread them out, a fan of numbers and legal terms. "Now, about the interest, Samuel," he began, his voice dropping to a tone of feigned sympathy. "The drought has been hard on everyone. The bank has to protect itself. The variable rate, you understand." He spoke for 10 minutes, his words a smooth, confusing river of financial jargon. He made it all sound reasonable, inevitable. He made Samuel's failure sound like a foregone conclusion. When he left the papers on the table, a stark white reminder of their precarious situation. That night, Mylin saw Samuel hunched over the table, the lantern light casting deep shadows on his face. He looked older, more defeated than ever before. He ran a hand through his hair, staring at the numbers as if they were a death sentence. Later, after he had gone to bed, Mylin went to clear the table. She picked up the banker's statements and the worn, leather-bound ledger where Samuel kept his accounts. Her eye scanned the columns. She was a woman who had learned arithmetic by calculating shares of rice down to the last grain. Her mind was sharp, orderly. And something felt wrong. A small, discordant note in Abernathy's symphony of debt. The interest payment he was demanding this month seemed higher than the last, even though no new funds had been borrowed. It was a small detail, a discrepancy most would overlook. But Mylin noticed. She folded the papers neatly and put them away, but the number stayed in her mind, a tiny, sharp stone in the smooth surface of the day. The summer heat, which had baked the plains to a pale, brittle yellow, broke with a sudden and violent fury. An unseasonable chill swept down from the north, and within a day, the sky turned a flat, ominous grey. Then came the snow. Not a gentle flurry, but a blinding, horizontal blizzard, driven by a howling wind that clawed at the little cabin. The world shrank to the four walls of their home and the swirling white chaos outside. Samuel's first thought was for the livestock, but his second, more panicked thought was for the chickens. A flock that size, in their simple runs, would be wiped out by the cold. It would be the final, killing blow to the homestead. He pulled on his coat, bracing himself to face the storm, expecting to find a disaster. But when he fought his way to the chicken coop, he stopped in amazement. The windward side of the coop and the wire runs had been reinforced with a thick layer of mud mixed with straw, applied weeks ago. It had dried in the sun to an adobe-like hardness, forming a solid barrier against the wind. Inside, the coop was deep with fresh, dry bedding, and the air, while cold, was still. The chickens were huddled together, but they were alive and calm. Mylin had anticipated this. She had seen the signs in the sky, felt the shift in the air, and prepared. During the weeks of relentless heat, she had been working, one small thing at a time, to fortify their most vulnerable asset. The blizzard raged for 3 days. They were trapped. The small pile of firewood by the door, which Samuel had stacked, became their lifeline, keeping the stove lit, the one source of warmth in the cabin. Their food stores were perilously low. But here again, Mylin's quiet foresight made the difference. She brought out things she had stored away, things the others hadn't even noticed. jars of dried mushrooms she had gathered from a hidden copse of trees, tins of preserved wild berries, bundles of dried roots that, when boiled, made a thick, nourishing broth. She had stretched their supplies, supplemented them, and built a hidden larder against the disaster she knew was always possible. They ate better during the storm than they had in months. The crisis, which should have broken them, instead drew them together. The shared warmth of the stove, the enforced proximity, broke down the rigid walls of their silence. They survived the blizzard not just on stored food and a fortified coop, but on the quiet, steady competence of the woman Samuel had hired only to tend his chickens. On the second night of the blizzard, the wind howled like a hungry animal, and the world outside was an abyss of white. Inside the small cabin, the air was warm and thick with the smell of stew and wood smoke. David was asleep, tucked securely in his bed. Martha was reading by the fire, the repaired dress folded carefully in a box beside her. Samuel and Mylin sat at the table, a rare moment of stillness between them. He was cleaning a piece of tack, his hands moving with slow, methodical grace. She was sorting dried beans, her fingers flicking them into separate piles, good, split, and blighted. For a long time, there was only the sound of the wind and the soft click of beans on the wooden table. Samuel finally broke the silence. He was looking at her hands, at the efficiency and purpose in their every movement. "Where did you learn all this?" he asked, his voice low. "The chickens. The herbs. How to prepare for this?" He gestured with his head toward the rattling window. It was the most direct, personal question he had ever asked her. Mylin did not stop her work, but her hands slowed. She looked down at the beans, a tiny mountain range of sustenance she had created. "In my village," she began, her voice soft and even, "the land was old and tired. The rains did not always come. We had many, many people, and not enough to feed them." She paused, her mind clearly traveling back to a place of hardship he could barely imagine. "To survive, you learn. You learn which weeds you can eat. You learn how to make a sick animal well, because you cannot afford to lose it. You learn how to save everything. Every grain of rice. Every drop of water. Every bit of warmth." She looked up at him then, her dark eyes clear and direct, holding no plea for pity. "We did not have bankers," she said simply. "We had famine. The accounting is the same. You count what you have, what you need, and what you will lose if you are not careful." The confession, delivered as a plain statement of fact, landed in the quiet room with immense weight. It explained everything about her, her habit of taking the smallest portion, her constant, silent work, her readiness to leave, embodied by the still-packed bundle on her cot. She was not just competent, she was a survivor, forged in a crucible of scarcity he had never known. He looked at her, this small, quiet woman in a grey dress, and saw for the first time the immense strength she carried, a strength that was now holding his world together. He gave a slow nod, a gesture of profound, unspoken respect. The silence that fell between them now was different. It was not empty. It was full. When the snow finally melted under a returning sun, the world outside was a clean, white canvas. But the reprieve was short-lived. A week later, Mr. Abernathy returned. His fine horse picked its way through the mud, and his polished shoes were immediately soiled, a fact that deepened the sour twist of his mouth. He did not bother with pleasantries this time. "Samuel," he said, striding into the cabin, his voice sharp and devoid of its usual false bonhomie. "The bank's patience has run out." He slapped a thick packet of papers onto the table. "Foreclosure proceedings. You have 30 days to pay the full amount of the loan, plus all outstanding interest and penalties." It's all there in black and white. The amount he named was impossibly high, a figure so far beyond their means it was laughable. Samuel stared at the papers, his face turning ashen. It was over. The fight he had been fighting since Sarah's death was finally lost. Abernathy seemed to relish the moment. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But I am a reasonable man. I have a proposal. I am acquiring several properties in this area. Consolidating them. I'll need experienced hands. You could work for me. A bunkhouse, 3 meals a day. A small wage to send back to wherever. His eyes flicked contemptuously towards Mylin, who stood silently by the stove. It's a generous offer, Samuel. A way to clear your debt and provide for your family. The threat was clear. Surrender the land, become his servant, or be cast out with nothing. As Abernathy turned to leave, pleased with his work, Mylin spoke. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the air with the precision of a blade. Mr. Abernathy, he stopped, turning back to her with an irritated look. May we see the original loan agreement? The one Mr. Bell and his late wife signed. Abernathy's eyes narrowed. Why? It's a standard contract. The terms are all reflected in the current statements. We would like to see it anyway, Mylin insisted, her gaze unwavering. A flicker of something, annoyance, or perhaps caution, crossed the banker's face. He hesitated, then gave a dismissive shrug. Fine. I'll have a copy sent from the bank. It won't change a thing. He tipped his hat with mocking politeness and left. That night, the cabin was thick with a despair so heavy it felt hard to breathe. Samuel sat slumped at the table, staring into space. But Mylin was not defeated. She was beginning an investigation. The wrong number in the ledger was no longer just a stone in her shoe, it was the starting point of a map. That night, after the children were asleep and Samuel had fallen into a restless, exhausted slumber, Mylin began her work. She cleared the big kitchen table. She lit a second lantern, flooding the small space with a bright, clear light. From her small, neat bundle, the one she had never fully unpacked, she retrieved a few precious items, a small block of ink, a grinding stone, a fine-tipped brush, and a small, wooden abacus. She laid out the papers, the foreclosure notice, the recent statements from Abernathy, and the worn household ledger. When a rider delivered the copy of the original loan agreement the next day, she added it to the collection. For 2 nights, she worked. The cabin was silent save for the click of the abacus beads and the soft scratch of her brush on fresh paper as she copied out the figures. She was building a case, one number at a time. The original agreement was clear. It was a simple interest loan, at a fixed rate, signed by Samuel and Sarah Bell. But Abernathy's statements told a different story. She found it on the second night, a discrepancy buried in a column of fees. He had been calculating the interest not on the original principal, but on the principal plus the previous month's interest. It was compound interest, illegally applied. Furthermore, she cross-referenced the dates on the statements with Samuel's own ledger. She found records of 3 payments Samuel had made on time, which Abernathy's books listed as late, each one accruing a heavy penalty fee. The banker had been systematically and fraudulently inflating the debt for years, counting on Samuel's grief and lack of financial sophistication to hide his crime. She laid it all out on clean sheets of paper. On one side, the bank's figures. On the other, the correct figures, calculated according to the original contract. The difference was staggering. The Bells were not only not on the verge of foreclosure, they were nearly paid up. The next time Mr. Abernathy arrived, expecting a broken man ready to surrender his land, he found Samuel standing on the porch, waiting for him. Mylin stood just inside the doorway, visible over Samuel's shoulder. Mr. Abernathy, Samuel said, his voice quiet but hard as iron. We need to talk about your math. He led the banker inside. On the table, Mylin's papers were laid out in 2 stark, undeniable columns. Abernathy paled. He blustered, he threatened, he accused. But Samuel did not argue. He just pointed to the figures. The contract says simple interest. You charged compound. Here is the proof. He tapped a page. These 3 payments were made on time. You charged penalties. Here are my ledger entries, and the receipts. Abernathy stared at the meticulous columns, the clear, precise brushstrokes of the characters next to them. He looked from the papers to Mylin's calm, implacable face. He was not just caught, he had been dismantled, his complex fraud taken apart piece by piece by a woman he had dismissed as another mouth to feed. He deflated. The bluster vanished, replaced by the pinched, sour look of a man who had been outmaneuvered. Without another word, he gathered his foreclosure notice, turned, and walked out of their lives forever. That evening, in the quiet aftermath of the victory, Mylin went to her cot. She began, as she did every night, to check her small, packed bundle. Samuel came and stood beside her. He watched her hand smooth the fabric. Then, he gently placed his own large, calloused hand over hers, stilling the motion. "Stay," he said. The word was rough, quiet, but it held the weight of everything he had been unable to say for months. Mylin. Stay. It was the first time he had said her name with such warmth, such undisguised need. She looked from his hand covering hers, up to his face. She saw the gratitude, the respect, the hesitant, dawning affection in his eyes. Slowly, deliberately, she untied the knot on her bundle. For the first time since she had arrived, she began to unpack. The next morning, there were 4 chairs set at the table. Thank you for watching.